once you started expanding your staff, were other people who are part of your staff, did they have the big picture? And then also, what about people at the World Bank and these other large organizations that you're kind of a front company for? Did they have the big picture?
Great question, Mike. And the question to the answer to both of those questions is essentially no. At the World Bank, there were people that knew, and the people at the top certainly knew. But most of the people who were analyzing my reports and did not, and in fact would try to punch holes in my forecasts. I had to defend them very, very strongly, which I became very expert at doing and very good at doing. So these people were hired basically to pick apart the reports of consultants. But their bosses knew. They were part of the system. There were always, in all of these organizations, there are a few people who are the economic hitmen who know what's going on, and the rest are pretty much kept in the dark, and they're doing their jobs, what they see as their jobs. But in the end, the economic hitman went out because we all know. I mean, so if you're a PhD economist who's assigned to pick apart my study and punch holes in it if you can, you do that. I defend it strongly. Your boss is on my side ultimately. He's an economic hitman too. So in the end, I'm going to win. But there's going to be a song and a dance. So there's a great paper trail that shows that you really did your job. You tried to punch holes in me, but in the end, you became convinced that everything I was saying was true, was fact. And you get promoted, and you get a good bonus. Well, maybe at the World Bank it's a different set of bonus systems, but you get the goodies too by going along ultimately. Well, as far as the people that I hired is concerned, and this became a very important part of my final decision to leave that world, because I kept hiring young men and women to go out and do the same thing I was doing, but I never told them that they were doing it. They did not get the benefit that I get of a Claudine who trained them and said, this is what you're going to do and you're in for life. Instead, I told them what the results were that I wanted. If they went off to work in Saudi Arabia or Bolivia or wherever I sent them, I let them know that they better damn well come back with a really high forecast, with the kind of numbers that I wanted to see. If they didn't, they wouldn't have a job. If they did, they would get promoted. They would get good Christmas bonuses. I mean, I controlled all that. And I also was very manipulative in convincing them. I mean, and at the time I was also publishing a lot of professional papers. I had a couple of very astute young people working for me. One was a PhD from MIT, a mathematician. He got his PhD from MIT when he was 22 years old. He was a young man from India, and brilliant. And he produced the kind of results I wanted. We wrote these papers. So we had a whole system in place of convincing everybody that what they were doing was right, and then rewarding them, or the carrot and stick approach, that they get well rewarded when they did what I wanted, and if they didn't do it, they didn't get rewarded, and they might get fired. So they didn't have the same benefit that I did of being told, this is what you're doing. And in the end, that made me feel very guilty that I'd manipulated people like that. It was one of the reasons that I wanted to get out, and one of the reasons that I wrote the book, because that's typical throughout these organizations. There are people doing that. Throughout the corporate world, I know people who work for big corporations now that are outsourcing, that have sweatshops in Asia producing the goods that they're selling in the United States, paying people $1 a day or less, people who are working in terrible conditions. And the men and women who are in charge of those operations out of places like Seattle and Portland and San Francisco and various other places, these men and women are going into these countries. They know, in their hearts, they know that what they're doing isn't right. But back home in the headquarters office is a whole team of psychologists, lawyers, and others telling them that what they're doing is fine, it's good. And that the people who are working in the sweatshops getting $1 a day are better off than as if they didn't have those jobs, which is patently absurd, because those people, many of them lived on subsistence economies. True, they may never have made any money before, but they lived very well on subsistence economies until these companies came in and created a local market, a local economy that now depends on the dollar. So in a very few years, they've gone from living subsistence lives and statistically having no money at all, totally impoverished statistically, but their lives are quite good, to now suddenly having to work for these big corporations, working in these sweatshops, making $1 a day, dependent on the dollar economy, or maybe it's $10 a day, whatever, but dependent on that money, and the subsistence existence they had before is gone, and then that company the next year decides that the labor pool is cheaper someplace else, and they move out. And these people who become dependent on these pittances they've been paid by our companies suddenly don't have even the pittance. And it's a terribly tragic situation. And the men and women who are the equivalent of the corporate economic hit people who are doing this, I know them. I know a number of them personally. In their hearts, they know what they're doing is wrong, but they're being well rewarded. Their families are being taken care of. Someone's patting them on the back saying, isn't it wonderful that you're making it possible for these people to get $1 a day? And they have a whole team, as I said before, psychologists, economists, and lawyers telling them that everything they do is perfectly good and for the best and for the best of the world. That's how we build empire.
So tell us about Panama, because it became evident when you read the book that you actually ended up having a friendly relationship with that country's leader.
Omar Torrijos, yes, I would like to think of him as a good friend. And, you know, as I think I said earlier, Mike, sometimes when I look at my own story, I just heard you ask that question, I'm thinking, Omar Torrijos, when I first went to Panama, his picture was up on this billboard, and he was a mythical figure to me. He was probably going to be up for a Nobel Prize had he not been assassinated. He was one of these bigger-than-life people, and to think that I spent time with him and met him, as I look back, is just pretty amazing to me. This young man from rural New Hampshire, and my life, it seems unbelievable to me at times. If I hadn't lived it, I'm not sure. You know, and as you read the book, I tried to write it to bring out some of that feeling, and sometimes it reads more like a James Bond novel, I think, than the biographies of most economists. But that's the life I lived. It was that way. Great food, great booze, fast women, and lots of power, money, sex, the whole works, you know. And Omar Torrijos was a magnificent man. He had his faults, like everybody. But he saw that clearly what I was going to do. He invited me to this little bungalow outside Panama City to have a private meeting with him. And he said, look, you know, I know what you're doing. I know the game you guys are playing. And I know what you're going to do is inflate all these forecasts, and you're going to give me a system that I can use and a few of my wealthy friends, but my country's going to suffer, and your country's going to get rich, and you're going to have a hold on me. What you really want is my canal. So I'm not going to let this happen. He said, you know, but what I will do is if you will agree with me to come in here and do a study and you know, put together a plan that really helps my people, helps the poorest of the poor, then I'll see to it that you and your company get more and more projects. But you got to be honest, you got to do good work. So basically what he was telling me is, don't be an economic hitman, be what you know, truly be what you say you are, and do a good job at it. And I welcomed this, of course, and ultimately so did my company, because it got business. But of course, what Omar Torrijos was doing in this process was defying the whole system, because the system is built on an assumption that the people at the top are all corruptible. And if you find someone at the top who isn't corruptible, then he can destroy the system, not only in that country, but in many other places. Because once someone starts to resist and someone starts to point out the truth behind the system and the fact that it can be opposed, then everybody in the system sees a threat and is in trouble. We've watched this happen so many places. Arbenz in Guatemala, Allende in Chile, Torrijos in Panama. We've seen it happen in Africa. We've seen it happen in Asia, in the Middle East. We've seen it happen over and over and over again. And these men who take that stance are taking their lives in their hand, literally. Now, Torrijos successfully, ultimately negotiated a canal treaty with President Carter's administration. The canal treaty passed our our Congress by one vote, and it was very divisive. And of course, the right-wing conservative elements strongly opposed it. The other thing that was happening is that Torrijos was negotiating with the Japanese to build a sea-level canal. The current canal is based on locks, and it can't take the largest of our ships. And so a sea-level canal would be able to do this. So the Japanese were saying that they would finance it, and then, of course, if they financed it, they would construct it. Well, this deeply upset our big construction companies. And at that time, the president of one of those largest companies was George Shultz. The senior counsel lawyer at Bechtel was Caspar Weinberger. They were very incensed that Torrijos was even talking to the Japanese about this. After the Canal Treaty was negotiated, Carter then lost the next election to Reagan. Shultz came out of being president of Bechtel and became Secretary of State. Weinberger left Bechtel and became Secretary of Defense. And the Reagan administration tried to renegotiate the Canal Treaty with Torrijos. He wouldn't do it. They tried to get him to agree to specifics like leaving our military bases in there, and most importantly of all, they desperately tried to get him to stop talking to the Japanese about a sea-level canal. He refused. He was a very integritous man in these regards. He absolutely refused, and so one day his Twin Otter plane, the presidential plane, blew up, and he was killed. And I was waiting for it to happen. This is the way the Jackals do things, and there was a lot of evidence that a tape recorder that he'd been given before the plane took off was a bomb. There's no question in my mind, and there's no question in a lot of the minds of a lot of the investigators throughout South America. People knew that this was a CIA orchestrated assassination. Of course, it hardly made our press. And next, Noriega took over. And Noriega was not an Omar Torrijos by any means. He was a much more corrupt individual. He had a lot of very unpleasant personal habits. He was not charismatic, but he stuck to his guns to a large degree. He too refused to give up negotiating with the Japanese. He refused to renegotiate the Canal Treaty. He refused to allow the American military bases to stay. They left and went to Ecuador. So as an upshot of that, of course, we invaded Panama in 1989. 2,000 to 3,000 Panamanians, innocent civilians, were killed in the process, and Noriega was taken prisoner and still sits in a prison in Miami, Florida.
Did you ever hear firsthand about using the Jackals if you guys failed in your endeavors? Was that something that Claudine had told you about, or I mean, how do you know that for sure?
Yeah, Claudine did tell me about that. It was one of the motivating forces for me to do a good job, and all of us, economic hitmen. We didn't want to see the Jackals come in. I sure did not want to see Omar Torrijos assassinated. So it was an inspiration for us. It was one of the things that concerned me when I worked out this deal with Omar, to really do the real job rather than the economic hitman job. And I talk about this extensively in Confessions of an Economic Hitman, that at one point I got very concerned that Torrijos, that, all right, I'm going along with what he's saying, and I'm happy that I'm doing it, but what's the implications for him, and ultimately for me? We knew the Jackals were always there lurking in the shadows, and it was a tremendous push for us to do what we were supposed to do and do it efficiently so they wouldn't have to come in. They're very much a part of the system, and I knew a number of them personally, and I still do. I know a couple of them who are now in Iraq.
And do they work through U.S. governmental organizations like the CIA? And I ask that because we're looking at more and more in this day and age where private contractors, at least for military operations, are being used, the DynCorp, things like that.
Correct. That's how they work. The Jackals, the Jackals that I know are never CIA employees. They work for companies like Executive Solutions, companies with names like this. I'm not even sure they get the names right, but Global Alternatives. Most of these companies, incidentally, are offshore companies. They're British or Australian. They're not U.S. companies. So The people who work for them don't pay U.S. taxes. They don't pay any taxes. I have a good friend who's a jackal who's in Iraq today. He's been in this business for years. He's making over $300,000 a year tax-free. And they, of course, they're not paid by the Defense Department. They're usually paid, the companies get contracts with the State